Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. In today's video, a very interesting video about light, stops of light, and dynamic range. And you don't need to be a wildlife photographer to enjoy this one. So let's talk about it right after this. Today's video is part one on a series of videos that I'm going to do. And part of this series is going to involve dynamic range. Before I get into dynamic range, I need to talk about a couple of other concepts because we're going to mention some of this in the video, and I just want to give you a very basic understanding. In my videos, if you've watched any of my channel, you know I am extremely practical. This isn't a graduate level course on photons and wavelengths and light gathering. This is really for intermediate beginner photographers that are looking for a better understanding of some things. And it video serves as a precursor to another video that I'm going to do around camera technology and sensors. Now, you may have watched that video already and come back to watch this one, or maybe you just want to learn a little bit more about dynamic range and things like stops of light. So regardless of the reason you found yourself here, I think you're going to find the video pretty interesting. And we're going to start at the very foundation of how a sensor works. When we think about sensors, it is simply a collection of millions of pixels. Pixels being these tiny little light gathering devices, these photoreceptors. In a modern digital camera, we've got between 20 million and maybe 60 million of these individual photoreceptors doing their jobs. These pixels require light to function. I want you to think of it as on a very basic level. Think of this as like a bucket. And when the bucket has no water in it, it's empty. And when the pixel is not receiving any light, it is going to be black. There's no data to record, so it's just going to show up as a black image. And remember, our sensor and our images are just collections of pixels, each of them doing its job to collect light and assign it a color value and a luminance or a brightness value. That's what that pixel is doing at its very basic level. And if there's no light there, it can't do its job at all. And it will show up as black if you looked at that individual pixel. On the other side of that spectrum, if that bucket starts to fill up and gather water, there's a limit to how much it can receive. And just like that, there's a limit to how much a pixel can receive in terms of light and still record data. At some point, there's too much light there and the data is unrecordable, and that will show up as white. So just think of it on a very simple term, that each pixel has a spectrum between white and black that it can record. If there's not enough light, black. If there's way too much, white. And those extremes are important when we talk about dynamic range. So when we think about the final image being a collection of individual pixels and each pixel requiring light, there's another thing we need to understand, which is how do we get light into the camera? And we're going to talk about two physical ways that as a photographer you control your equipment to allow light into the sensor. In this example, we're going to imagine that we can't control the amount of available light. The available light is what it is. But we have two things that we can control that determine the amount of light coming into the camera and being read by those pixels and forming that image. The first one is called aperture, and this is the opening of the lens itself. The more open it is, pretty simply, it allows more light in. The more we shut down that aperture, it allows less light in. Now, there are other things that aperture does concerning depth of field, but for this video, we're just really talking about the amount of light coming in. And so opening or closing an aperture will determine how much light can come in. The second thing that we can do as photographers is control our shutter speed. And the faster our shutter is, the more it opens and closes, or the faster it opens and closes, the less light that's in. But if we allow it to be open longer, we allow more light to come in. So we can control those two things to determine how much light enters our camera to create that appropriate exposure. There are ramifications of each. I mentioned aperture controls depth of field as well, and shutter speed affects the amount of motion blur that can be in a final image. But that's not what we're talking about in today's video. We're just talking about how to control the light coming in. So aperture controls light and shutter speed controls light. Now there's a third component. When we talk about photography, we normally talk about this thing called the exposure triangle. This third one over here, we're going to leave off of the equation for now, and that is called ISO or ISO, because that doesn't determine how much physical light comes into the camera. That's a separate function of the amount of amplification or gain that we can introduce to the camera to amplify the signal or make it brighter or darker, but it does not control the amount of light coming into the camera and being recorded at the sensor level. So that's an important distinction. And for that reason, we're going to deal with that in another video. So at the very basic level, that's how pixels gather light. And just understand that there's a floor and a ceiling. For this video, that's going to be the important concept. The next thing I want to talk about is just stops of light. So in its very definition, a stop of light is simply a doubling or halving of the amount of light entering the camera and being recorded by the sensor. Doubling the amount of light coming in or halving the amount of light that's coming in. And each of that doubling or halving is considered a stop. Now let me just throw an image up here real quick because I'll explain how this works and you'll get the concept when I put the images over here. But let's start with this image. For all of the images I show you, the aperture is the same and the ISO is the same, or the ISO is the same. The only thing I'm going to change is the shutter speed. When I mentioned that a stop of light is a doubling or halving of light, we're going to start with this exposure at 1/100th of a second. The shutter is open for 1/100th of a second. And if I say a stop is doubling or halving, I'm going to allow half the light to come in. I'm going to make this exposure one stop darker. And in order to do that, I have to double the shutter speed. I have to make it twice as fast. So I'm going to go from 1/100th of a second to this image at 1/200th of a second. And notice it's darker. Now I'm going to go to this exposure, which is one stop darker. And in order to get one stop darker, remember, I can half the light coming into the sensor. And to do that, I need to double the shutter speed. And in this case, I'm now going from 1/200th of a second to 1/400th. Let's go one more stop. Let's double the shutter speed again to 1/800th. That's one more stop. And let's do one final doubling. We'll double from 1/800th to 1/1600th, and I get one stop darker. Let me put them all up here with the settings. What I want you to notice is that each of these is considered one stop of light, and that stop is half the amount of light coming into the camera, period. The other thing I want you to notice is that it's not a linear change in shutter speed. So I didn't do this. I didn't start at 1/100th and go to 200th, and then 300th, and then 400th, and then 500th. What I did is double the setting before, so it looks what we call exponential. 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600. If I put it on a graph, it looks like this. Stops of light at the bottom, shutter speed on this axis here, and look at the curve that it creates. So it's an exponential function. By the way, if I were to do this with aperture, it would be the same thing. I would change my aperture so that half the light was coming in through the opening, and my exposure would go down by one stop each time I made that opening half of what it was before. And it's half is a little bit tough. Aperture is a little bit different, but just understand, I use shutter speed because it's an easier example. It's half the amount of light coming in through the opening. It's not always half the diameter of the opening. So that's a little bit different. Maybe I'll deal with that in another video. But this should help you out, right? One stop, and just look at those shutter speeds, doubling each time. That makes sense so far, right? So I've got how do I gather light really quickly, the pixels collecting the light. There's a floor and a ceiling. I now understand what a stop of light looks like. I just showed you that spectrum of what a stop of light looks like. And in this case, we've got 5 stops of difference in exposure. Now, going to get a little trickier as we deal with dynamic range, but I think I can make this one make sense for you too. What dynamic range is? Simply put, if I look at a scene or if I look at an image, whether it's with my eye or on the monitor, how much can I see in terms of detail from the darkest area, the black? Remember I said that pixel, when there's no light, it can't gather any more information. It shows up as black, to the brightest area of a scene. And that range that's in there, we can break that into stops of light from the darkest to the lightest. How many stops can I see in between? The human eye is said to have 24 stops of dynamic range. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's pretty consistently out there. So 20 to 24 stops of dynamic range. And remember that dynamic range doubled with each stop. Can you imagine that? Each stop was twice what it was before, and I do that 20 or 24 times. It's an incredible amount of information that the human eye can see. The human eye is incredible. And then you think about our eyes compared to some of my wildlife friends' eyes, and theirs are even more incredible. So just It is spectacular what we can see with our human eye in terms of this dynamic range and also in terms of color. With a mirrorless camera, with a digital camera, it's a little bit different. A digital camera sensor cannot capture those individual pixels, cannot capture the same dynamic range that we can. So if we look at the brightest part of an image and the darkest part of an image, instead of seeing 24 stops in between, we might only see 8 to 12. Now there's some other factors in here, so down in the comments, try to keep this simple. I know there's some technical stuff you could comment down there about the ISO and its effect on dynamic range, but I'm going to cover that in another video. But for this video, let's just say a camera has 8 to 12 stops of dynamic range. Some of them have a little bit more. If you own an iPhone or an Android or a cell phone that you're taking pictures with, the dynamic range is probably even less. You may be down 4, 6, or 7 stops of dynamic range. Now, I'm going to show you real quickly what that difference in dynamic range can look like. So over on the side here, I'm going to pull up a picture. I went outside and I studied the environment. Lightest area, darkest area. I picked an area that had good contrast, the lightest to the darkest area. And with my human eye, I could see it all. I had no problem making out the definition in these overcast, hazy clouds that were up there. I also had no problem seeing all of the detail in this wooded, shaded area down at the bottom. But when I took my camera out, look what happened. It looks different. Remember, my eye can see 24 stops between the bright and the dark areas, and I can see all the details in between. But my camera is limited to its dynamic range, in this case, probably 10 stops. And it looks different. This is not what I saw with my human eye. My human eye could see much more than this. So when we have limited dynamic range, we can't make out the detail in the same extreme when we have a highlighted area and a shadow area. We can't make out the detail if it's extreme. Fortunately for us, most pictures are not this extreme. Most images have a dynamic range. It's easily within 6 to 10 stops, and almost all cameras can record that. But not all scenes are like that. There are some that are more challenging. Let me show you another example, and I'll flip screens for this one. I'm going to go over to this view. This is my pool outside. I just have my tripod set up. This is where I record some of my birds bathing and take some images out there. But this scene has a black liner and some shadows on the rocks. And then it had some raindrops and some light areas up here. So let's look at the left and you'll see a very dark area. And if we look at the right over here on this little frond, this little leaf that's coming off, it's got some droplets and some white highlights here. And then these rocks also have some whites. Let's assume this is 10 to 12 stops of dynamic range that my camera can record. I can see, and you might not come through the monitor, but I can see the details in these shadows. And I have the ability in Photoshop, if I want, to pull these up a little bit more. The data is there. I can see it. So if I want to enhance it or change it a little bit, I can actually do some editing to even bring those shadows up even more. But as I get more limited with my dynamic range, it might look like this. And this might be down to like 6 stops of dynamic range. And here, those dark areas are turning black and they're losing the detail. So even in Photoshop, there's nothing I can do. I can't pull those up because the detail's lost. And those highlights on that little leaf that's bending down, they're starting to get washed out. Now, if I make it even, maybe an old cell phone camera may only have 4 stops of dynamic range or something like this. And now there's no data here in the black. I can't Photoshop this. I can't lift the shadows. I can't boost it. There's nothing I can do. There's no information there. The highlight on the rocks is starting to fade away. I'm losing all this detail. And then up here on that leaf that's curled over, I'm losing the detail there. Limited dynamic range limits the amount of data I have at the extremes. That's got to make sense to you, right? Let me go back. As I pull in and get better dynamic range, I get more information in the shadows and the highlights. And then finally, an image like this with a modern mirrorless camera or modern digital camera, I get pretty good definition and I can see the shadows pretty much everywhere. If it was more extreme, I might have more problems with that. And I might need a camera with better dynamic range. But most modern cameras are capable of capturing most situations that we want to do, no matter what the photography is. However, it is important to note that a camera with better dynamic range, and there are some other benefits as well, but a camera with better dynamic range will typically perform better when you have these extremes, but they will never duplicate what we could see with our human eye. I don't know when we're ever going to get to the point where they can, but who knows with technology if that'll ever happen. And that's my very simple video for you. Just a real quick introduction to dynamic range and what it is. More importantly, I want it to make sense, because I'm doing a follow-up video where I'm going to talk about dynamic range, and I'm not going to be able to explain it all there. So I'm hoping I may have caught some people that started with that video and came over here to check it out. Some of my audience may just be interested in this and find that out. So some of my followers, and if you're not one of my followers, I will tell you, go down and hit the subscribe button. In my playlist, you're going to see some features on wildlife and especially around bird photography. But I also have a lot of product reviews that are not specific to just a wildlife photographer. So while my slant is typically towards wildlife photography, I will tell you, even if you're just a general camera enthusiast or a general photographer, you might want to subscribe to the channel because I think you'll find the content really interesting. There are playlists down there. So I've got reviews, I've got these educational pieces. I also do opinion pieces where I really love to get your comments and your feedback. So you may find those interesting as well. Now, if you haven't hit the bell, hit that for notifications because that'll let you know when I have a new video out. And I say it in every video, so I'm going to say it again today. I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.